The president of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to this afternoon's conversation, which will feature General David D. Thompson, the Vice Chief of Space Operations for the United States Space Force. We're very excited to have him here today, given all the news about our space program and landings on Mars. Our host today will be FPRI's National Security Senior Fellow and Board of Advisors member, Dr. John Nagl. In addition to his FPRI affiliations, John is also the head of the Haverford School and a retired lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army, and on the team that produced the U.S. Army and Marine Corps Counterinsurgency Manual. He's also the author of Learn to Eat Soup with a Knife, Counterinsurgency Lessons from Malaya and Vietnam. I would also, as this is our mainline series, like to give a special shout out to our sponsors, James Gately, John Piasecki, and Eileen Rosenau, as well as thank our board members, our sponsors, and our members who are online. And also send a reminder that even though this event is free to all of you, it's not free to us, so do consider making a donation to us. We will be taking questions and answers, Q&A, about halfway through the program, so please put those in the Q&A box, preferably not the chat box because we won't be looking for questions there, but in the Q&A box. So without further ado, let me go ahead and turn it over to John Nagl.
Thanks, Raleigh, and thank you for your service as a member of our nation's clandestine service. God bless all of our men and women in uniform and out who serve this nation and work so hard to keep us safe. As Raleigh said, I'm John Nagl, 9th head of the Haverford School and your host for the Main Line Briefings. And I'm delighted today to lead a discussion of our nation's newest branch of military service, our Space Force. General David Thompson is the Vice Chief of Space Operations for the United States Space Force. As Vice Chief, he is responsible for assisting the Chief of Space Operations in organizing, training, and equipping space forces both in the United States and overseas, integrating space policy and guidance, and coordinating space-related activities for the U.S. Space Force and for the Department of the Air Force. General Thompson was commissioned in 1985 as a graduate of the U.S. Air Force Academy, where, among other things I have recently learned, he was a national heavyweight boxing champion, which he looks pretty impressive as is, zooming in from the Pentagon, but even more so when you know that. He's a career space officer with assignments in operations, acquisition, research and development, and academia. General Thompson has commanded operational space units at the squadron, group, and wing levels. He's also an Olmsted Scholar, a graduate of the Senior Acquisition course, and a Level 3 certified program manager. Prior to his assignment as Vice Chief of Space Operations, General Thompson was the Vice Commander of the U.S. Space Force. And General, I'd like to start off with an easy question, a layup for you, but one that our audience will benefit from hearing. Can you tell us what Space Force is, what its mission is, how many folks serve in the U.S. Space Force?
Yes, Dr. Nagl, thanks so much for the opportunity to join you today, and pass my thanks and greetings to Dr. Flynn as well. Let me talk a little bit about the U.S. Space Force. To put it very succinctly, the U.S. Space Force provides, trains and equips forces to operate alongside forces of the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force, and the Marine Corps. We provide space capabilities with those forces that allow those forces to navigate the globe, to communicate effectively, provide data and intelligence and warning information to them. We now need to protect and defend those capabilities for the joint forces, as well as generally defending and protecting the interests of the nation in space.
And how many troops do you have?
Right. So assigned to the U.S. Space Force today, we have about 16,000 folks. About 4,300 of those are uniformed members of the U.S. Space Force, commissioned officers, enlisted members of the Space Force. 6,000 are civilians, government civilians, and then we have 6,000 airmen, members of the United States Air Force, still assigned to the U.S. Space Force in our units, helping us conduct our daily mission. So 16,000 total, 4,300 in uniform, and then about 10,000 others.
And where is Space Force headquartered?
So Space Force headquarters, like the other services, is headquartered in the Pentagon. We're a lean and mission focused headquarters. Our final size will be probably about 600 folks. Today we're on the order of about 200. Very small and lean, but hopefully lethal.
Very good, sir. And although the Space Force itself is new, we've been using assets in space for some time. As a Desert Storm veteran, I've been told that that was really the first war in which space played a significant role. Is that accurate?
That is accurate. That's correct. We call it the first space war. It is truly the first war that used space capabilities. But use of space for national security purposes goes all the way back to the dawn of the space age. The launch of Sputnik in 1957 just wasn't about the Soviet Union's ability to launch nuclear weapons at the United States. It was about their ability to put satellites in orbit for national security purposes. The US did the same thing. Back in the late 50s and 60s, we used satellites for strategic reconnaissance, tracking Soviet Union's missile forces, bomber forces, strategic elements, their industrial capacity. Over the years, we grew space capabilities to include communications, weather forecasting, navigation, warning, and some other things. But it wasn't really until the first Gulf War in 1930s, the 1990s, when we really
I'm old, General, but I'm not that old.
Yeah, we really started using them in the concept of what I'll call military operations. You'll recall back then, and others will, the Scud threat that we had during that first Gulf War. We had built and were operating for years satellites that detected strategic missile launches, but we knew that they were capable enough to detect smaller intermediate range ballistic missiles like the Scud. And so we rapidly adapted a detection and warning network to provide warning to forces in preparing to fight in Iraq when Scud missiles were launched, and to allow them to take protective measures. At the same time, we were fielding this new constellation called the Global Positioning System. In fact, in the late 1990 and early 1991, we accelerated the launch of 3 GPS satellites and scoured the Department of Defense for GPS receivers. In those days, a small handheld GPS receiver was about the size of a shoebox. There were about 1,000 of them. And in fact, I was part of an effort to find all of those GPS receivers scattered about the DoD and send them to the desert, so that maneuver forces, usually at about the battalion level, could actually use or were trained and could use them to navigate in the deserts.
My battalion was on the receiving end of some of those,
Yep.
one of those shoeboxes.
And then finally recognized that the overhead reconnaissance wasn't just for strategic purposes, for target development and and understanding the formations and the defensive arrangements of Iraq. We started to pass overhead imagery and other products from space to planners and forces so that they could use them for military effect. So it was, in fact, the first war where we truly, down at the maneuver unit level, were incorporating space capabilities into military operations.
Thank you, sir. So we've been using space obviously for 30 years. We just I think the last discussion we had in the series was actually on the 30th anniversary of Operation Desert Storm and what we've learned. And so we've been using space effectively in military operations for 30 years, but we haven't had an independent space force until just over a year ago. Can you talk about what led to the creation of the Space Force as an independent entity?
Sure can. As you stated, we have been using space in the United States military and developed space forces and used space capabilities for decades. In fact, much like prior to 1947, with the creation of the U.S. Space Force, the United States Army developed and fielded and operated a tremendous Air Force. The Army Air Corps, the Army Air Forces were a tremendous Air Force that preceded the creation of the United States Air Force in 1947. For years, the United States Air Force has built and fielded and operated a tremendous set of space capabilities. But what really precipitated the change in the need for the independent Space Force was a recognition by our adversaries and potential adversaries, Russia and China, that we use those space capabilities to great effect. You think about the way we use GPS in our forces to navigate the globe with confidence, to maneuver with confidence, to strike with lethality and precision, the way we pass data globally through our space-based relay networks, the way we use space to collect intelligence, collect important data in that regard. All of those things that we've integrated now tightly over the last 30 years into military operations have created an outsized effect in terms of a strategic and tactical advantage. And so starting in about the middle of the last decade, Russia, China, and others began to develop and field counter space weapons to deny us those capabilities in conflict. And so now, not only are we faced with providing those capabilities like we always have, we need to provide them in the face of attack, protect and defend our capabilities. At the same time, Russia and China are building similar capabilities, and we need to understand the effect of those capabilities and their use against our forces and deny them in conflict. So it's really that evolution of space, unfortunately, as a warfighting domain that now demands a dedicated military service that operates in the face of conflict.
Both offensively and defensively, it sounds like.
Correct. Our job for a long time has been to deny capabilities. We have to look at all sorts of options to do that, as well as defending and protecting our own.
And those are relatively soft assets. It's hard to put Chobham armor on a space asset, I would guess.
They are today, and absolutely, our capabilities are tremendously capable. We remain the best in the world. They're exquisite, but none of them were really designed to operate in a contested domain. Certainly, there are aspects of them that will always be, perhaps, let's call it softer than others, but there are definitely ways to protect what we have today, to help disrupt and deceive and deny adversaries the ability to target, perhaps, our space capabilities. But going forward, we also have to design systems in the future and architectures in the future that are more resilient, more robust, made to survive and continue to perform in the face of attack. And there are a whole host of ways you might be able to do that. So that's another thing we have to do in the future, is design those capabilities with the fact that they need to operate under threat in mind.
And that leads to a good question from Lawrence, who asked both, what is the degree of coordination integration between Space Force and NASA, and between Space Force and civilian contractors such as Boeing, SpaceX, and so on?
Yeah, so I'll start with NASA. Actually, we've had a close partnership with NASA for decades, right? Preceded when we were part of the United States Air Force. Now today, primarily, NASA is focused on exploration, discovery, scientific purposes for space, and obviously our focus is military. But sometimes, in some cases, we share technology, right? There's a need to pass information. There are certain satellite systems that are required on all space systems. Sometimes sensors are used for common purposes. We share launch infrastructure. The United States Air Force first, now the Space Force, frankly, provides most of the launch infrastructure for the nation and has for years, as well as in some cases tracking and data relay and some other things. But it's mostly a technology and support related relationship because we have two different missions. As far as our relationship with industry, much like the other services, we have relied for years on a defense space industry to design and build our space systems for us, the Boeings, the Lockheed Martins, and Northrop Grummons and others of the world to do that. Increasingly, though, there is a burgeoning commercial market in space. You mentioned SpaceX. There are many of other commercial companies, not only in launch, but in communications and relay and remote sensing. I think we're on the cusp of a potential explosion in the commercial space market. And what we need to do is understand it, use the capabilities they provide directly when they meet national security needs, but also the innovation and the technology that they're using to build and field their space systems. We need to understand how they might be adapted and leveraged for national security purposes.
And we have, as you see, questions are exploding in the Q&A box, and we have an informed audience. So asking some great questions. How does the mission of the Space Force differ from that of the National Security Agency, the National Geospatial Agency, and the National Reconnaissance Office.
Yeah, so I'll say it's grown over the years, and it's relatively clean. There are some overlaps, but it's relatively clean. The National Reconnaissance Office and its partners, the National Security Agency and National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, focus primarily on ISR from space, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. They build and fly satellites and distribute data and information, primarily focused on geospatial intelligence, right? Imagery, synthetic aperture radar, and signals intelligence, the collection of various electronic signals from space. That's primarily their mission. The mission of the Space Force is significantly different. We provide positioning, navigation, and timing. The Space Force flies the GPS constellation, and we have for decades. We provide missile warning. We provide missile warning both strategic, tactical, and even down to the battlefield level in that regard. We provide global communications for forces on the move, for strategic leaders, all the way up to nuclear command and control. We provide those sorts of things in addition to the U.S. Space Force is the organization that tracks 26,000 plus objects in space. We keep track of where they are, where they're going to be. And in fact, we provide collision warning for all operators in space, to include commercial companies and potentially even the Russians and Chinese, should objects in space pose a hazard to one another. So we perform all those sorts of missions today, as well as others as we proceed into the future.
Thank you, sir. And I'm asking this question in the blind. What is the status of Space Systems Command stand-up? And I'm asking that not knowing what Space Systems Command is.
Sure. I'll talk just a little bit about it. One of the things we did in the first year is, while we were continuing to execute all of our missions, the missions that we had done as part of the Air Force had to continue without fail. So we did that in the first year as we designed the organization of the United States Space Force. And that includes 3 field commands. It includes the Space Operations Command that obviously operates the systems every single day. It includes a training and readiness command responsible for recruiting, training, educating, developing the Guardians, the members of the U.S. Space Force, and it includes a command responsible for the development, acquisition, and fielding of our space systems. And that we call Space Systems Command. The foundational element of Space Systems Command is Space and Missile Systems Center, a world-class space systems acquisition organization that's existed for decades. But we're going to add elements to it as well, and expect, I would say, stay tuned. Expect some announcements soon. We expect this summer to fully establish Space Systems Command.
Terrific. We have an interesting question about the magnitude of attacks on our space assets and our forces by our adversaries. The specific question is hacking attacks, which have been much in the news of late. To my knowledge, there have not been kinetic attacks, and if there have been, you may not be able to talk about it in this forum, but perhaps you can give us a sense of what our adversaries or potential adversaries' capabilities and actions to date have been.
Sure. I will say that they are developing and fielding capabilities to be able to attack us in all regimes, orbital regimes in space, by any number of means, in addition to, as you said, the ability to attack through cyber, the ability to conduct physical attack on infrastructure. But I would say that space from a cyber perspective is as vulnerable, perhaps even more vulnerable from a cyber perspective, as any other weapon system, for a couple of reasons. The first is because today the intent is, and the data they provide or the data we receive from space capabilities is provided via electronic link, right? RF and spectrums that connect them to the ground. So if in fact an adversary were able to attack from a cyber perspective and corrupt our ground systems, corrupt our data, prevent us from communicating with those satellites, they wouldn't have to do anything else to our space capabilities directly or kinetically to deny us the use of those capabilities. So the potential vulnerabilities of our space systems exist, just like any other system. But we do have, as we do in other areas, We have capabilities, we have defensive units, we have tools in place to protect our space systems from cyber attack. We have hunter teams that look for nefarious actors on the web. We continue to assess potential vulnerabilities, close those gaps, and put mitigation procedures in place so that such an attack is unlikely to occur. Knock on wood, such an attack has not occurred at this point. Certainly always a possibility, but I will say kinetic attack now is as increasingly a possibility as those other means of attack have been in the past. In 2007, the Chinese demonstrated the ability to kinetically attack and destroy a satellite in orbit. And since then, they and the Russians and others have been rapidly developing fielding kinetic weapons, electronic warfare weapons, all sorts of jammers, dazzlers, and means to kinetically attack our satellites.
And how do you assess the quality and the lethality of those Russian and Chinese counterparts to the U.S. Space Force right now?
They've demonstrated that these weapons are very lethal. There's a question right now, the intelligence estimates of just how many they have, how much a threat they pose at any given time. I'll tell you, on the jamming front, the ability to interfere electronically with our data links. Both countries have jamming systems and an order of battle that runs into the hundreds. So they have the ability to attack us in an electronic sense in a very large scale. Part of the challenge we have with our space systems today is they're incredibly capable, they're incredibly exquisite, but they're relatively small in number. So it doesn't take significant numbers of anti-satellite weapons, whether they be orbital or direct descent missiles launched from the ground, to be able to threaten a significant portion of the constellation. And so as they build up those 1 versus 1 types of kinetic attack weapons, we have a force design activity ongoing to create more distributed and more proliferated architectures that are harder to attack and to degrade and destroy in a 1v1 type attack, in addition to the development of systems to provide defensive capabilities as well. But they are very capable and growing in number.
Is it safe to say that we are still the leaders in space?
It is, absolutely. The Chinese are moving forward rapidly. They're very aggressive. They're investing heavily. One of the challenges we face is, as with many other weapon systems, we're in an acquisition cycle now that takes a long time to develop and fly in field. The Chinese cycle times, they can build and fly and operate weapon systems or satellites about 3 times as fast. So they're both increasing in number, they're increasing in sophistication. We are still the best in the world at space. Our capabilities are still the best, but we have got to adapt to the 21st century world, or we will be left behind sooner rather than later.
So you talked through a little bit of the acquisition and procurement function there. Is that independent of the rest of DoD? Do you rely on Air Force acquisitions? How does your acquisition system work?
No, our acquisition system, it was built. It is a very space-centric and space-focused acquisition system. It was built inside of the Air Force when we were part of the Air Force. So many of the processes, the oversight provided by the Office of Secretary of Defense, OMB, Congress, and all of those oversight processes are in place, but it is now a Space Force specific acquisition chain and set of organizations. What we need to do, and we're working with Congress and with OSD and OMB to develop, I'll call it oversight and acquisition processes that are more streamlined and allow us to be more agile in terms of more rapidly fielding capabilities.
Speaking of worrying things, how worried are you about a potential Kessler effect and its potential to shut off low Earth orbit?
Yeah, so today, let's just say
you have to define the Kessler.
Okay, I'm sorry. Okay, so the Kessler effect, I apologize. So I'll call it a cascading effect of collisions. As I said today, we track on the order of about 26,000 objects from low Earth orbit all the way out to beyond geosynchronous orbit from, let's just say from about 125 miles out to beyond 22,000 miles in orbit. There's a theory. So only about, I think today we're up to around 3,000 of those objects are actually functioning satellites. The rest is junk, old dead satellites, rocket bodies, bits of debris. And there's a theory called the Kessler effect that says, for example, that every time a collision occurs and generates debris, it increases the probability of additional collisions with additional debris. And the concern would be in certain orbital regimes, a cascading effect of collisions that generate new collisions that suddenly cloud specific orbits with these giant clouds of debris and make them unusable, because even a small object traveling at 17,000 miles an hour is going to damage and likely destroy a satellite. So that's the Kessler effect. What we have counted on for decades is what I call the small object, big space theory. And we hadn't really paid attention for years in terms of disposal of satellites that were no longer needed. The events that that occurred in space that generated debris, launching a satellite into orbit, deploying it for use, could create and leave behind dozens of pieces of debris. There are lots of, for the entrepreneurs out there, if they can all come up with a means by which to cost effectively remove that debris from orbit, they can be billionaires pretty quickly. But in the meantime, while we figure out how to unpollute the domain from all this debris that's been deposited over decades, we have put in place measures to stop creating additional debris, to carefully control the pieces that are created on deployment, to dispose of space systems properly once they're dead, rocket bodies and those sorts of things. So the Kessler effect is in fact a challenge potentially. As long as we continue to be careful about moving forward, I'm less concerned, but it is always a possibility.
And is that norm of right, being a good Boy Scout, I guess, and right, taking out all of your trash when you camp or when you hike, is that an international norm?
It is a generally accepted international norm. Some folks are able to and follow that norm. There are some agreements, international agreements in place that most people do follow that norm, but not all. But I think all recognize, especially responsible space actors, recognize and understand if they intend to use space, they cannot pollute the domain, especially if they would do it for the purpose of harming others and still expect to be able to use space. The Chinese ASAT test in 2007 created more than 3,000 pieces of debris that we track every single day. Almost 2,900 of them are still in orbit, and we still track them. Those sorts of tests, that sort of conduct, I think that was a wake-up call to a lot of people for several things. First of all, certainly the threat that is posed by that sort of a weapon, but second of all, the need not to engage in that sort of activity, certainly when not in conflict.
And I'd like to broaden that question. Can you talk through the process by which norms for space are created? Or are there space summits, sort of things?
So today, most of that work is conducted through the UN. I will tell you that progress in this area has been slow. People routinely refer to the Outer Space Treaty of 1967 as one of those, I'll call it watershed agreements by which we have agreed to how we've agreed to conduct ourselves in space. It's been a long time since 1967, and that was, while a landmark agreement, it covered very, very few specifics. We've been engaged with our friends and our partners, and in fact, we've been engaged with potential adversaries through the UN on the peaceful use of space for decades now, trying to forge ahead in a certain set of standards and norms and expectations for conduct. In some cases, in the last couple of years, we have made some progress, but there certainly is a need for not just informally and accepted norms and standards and rules of behavior. There is a need for some more specifics in that regard. For example, I'll tell you, in late 2019, the Russians launched an object into orbit, and they launched it in an orbit very close to one of our national security satellites. They then conducted a series of maneuvers and actions that were unsafe for their satellite and for ours, that were by our judgment unprofessional, but also hostile. In fact, that object 6 months later backed away from our satellite and conducted a weapons test. And so, much as some of that behavior in the Cold War and even today happens at sea, happens in the air, similar behaviors are happening today in space. We really do need to establish and make very clear what we believe is safe, what we believe is unsafe, what we believe is hostile, and when and where and how we expect people to behave if, in fact, they are responsible actors in space.
And my friends in the Air Force and the Navy describe that as trading paint, but there's, I would guess, less margin for error and less ability to do precise controls when you're in geosynchronous orbit.
Correct.
Right.
Yeah. In this case, low Earth orbit, right? So, and our friends in the Navy, trading paint by our friends in the Navy, there's some risk there. In my former service, the Air Force, trading paint has a lot more risk associated with it, and I would argue trading paint in space has even more risk. Other than obviously, there isn't risk to human life at that point.
Yes, sir. So you talked a little bit about international cooperation in the formation of norms. I believe that one of the great strengths of the United States is our allies and our partners. Can you describe the extent to which Space Force is able to work with our allies around the globe?
I sure will. And I'll refer briefly back to the dawn of the space age, when this was a great power competition, primarily focused on the United States and the Soviet Union. We had a tremendous set of capabilities, so did the Soviet Union. No one else did. And so we grew up in an era, or Space Forces grew up, where we held those capabilities and the information provided to them very closely, and didn't share it even with most partners and allies. In the years that have unfolded since then, especially since about the first Gulf War, our allies and partners have increasingly developed their own space capabilities and expressed great interest in partnering with us in military space operations and in, I'll say, forming coalitions and partnerships, just like we do, like you saw when you were in the Army, like we do right with the Navy and the Air Force. That started with what we call our Five Eyes partners, right? The Brits, the Canadians, the Australians, and the New Zealanders. The French have a great military space capability. The Germans have that same capability. The Japanese are interested in that partnership. We're certainly working with all of them very tightly in those coalitions and in a common set of desires and expectations. But our partnerships don't stop there. We actually completed a recent partnership with Norway. We're putting a hosted payload on one of Norway's satellites that saves us on the order of $900 million by allowing us to fly with them. Not just the Norwegians and the Japanese. We're looking at the rest of our NATO partners for opportunities to partner. We're looking for the South Koreans. There's a whole host of partners interested. In fact, we're looking at expanding partnerships into other parts of the world that we haven't pursued before in space. South America, there's interest from Brazil and others, as well as other Indo-Pacific partners who have tremendous space capabilities, who, because of the threats posed in space, the importance of space to general national security and economic security, have expressed an interest in partnering with the United States, and specifically, in a military sense, partnering with the U.S. Space Force.
And sir, are we able to sell our space systems to them? Are our defense contractors able to do that? Or are there limits on their ability to sell to even to the Five Eyes partners?
Yeah, there are some limits, not as many as there used to be. But I will say in some cases it's technology based, but perhaps more so in many cases, it's not just technology and arms control regime based. It's the limitations are financial. Oftentimes we find that our partners are unable to afford, I'll call them standalone space capabilities of their own. And so what happens is they join us in many of our common programs. As an example, the advanced EHF satellite systems, right? The highly protected communication systems. We have a partnership with many nations, and they will contribute funding. They will buy into use of the constellation, for example. They will, in some cases, pay for one of the satellites for use for the entire constellation. There are multiple ways in which we partner and we share costs. Typically, we don't sell and export space capabilities the way we do other weapon systems, but it doesn't mean something like that in the future may not be possible. We typically partner together in a common system, and they contribute costs and other sorts of material contributions.
And they get, and in return, they receive some of the benefits of the system, but
Correct.
presumably
They receive, that's right, benefits of the system, utilization of the system for their, their, and I'll call it our common security interests.
Mhm. I have a question on, a further question on organization. The organization of Space Force, and this questioner suggests the consolidation of the disparate DoD space offices was a primary motive of Congress, and then asks, when will the U.S. Space Force absorb NRO and Missile Defense Agency space missions? I thought you'd react that way.
Yes. So
they're listening, sir. They're listening. Just so you know.
Yes. No. Yes, they are, and they have information that they might use against me someday. No. So I'll tell you that's not while the previous administration had that as let's call that a potential vision. We have a tremendous partnership with the NRO today. In fact, I had an assignment in the NRO, and the U.S. Space Force provides about a third of the manpower in the NRO. So there's a close partnership there. There's a close partnership in our architectures. As we look to defend and protect our capabilities, our responsibility is not just to protect and defend U.S. Space Force capabilities. We are also required and need to protect and defend NRO capabilities, and in fact, other civil and commercial capabilities, if in fact the president, the commander-in-chief, says that we should. And so there's a close partnership there as well. Both organizations have, let's just say it this way, both organizations have enough mission, enough challenges, enough opportunity, and enough work to do today that for the foreseeable future, we certainly don't need to talk about how they might fit together. And if we continue in this manner for a long time, we can certainly be effective. If in the future somebody wanted to have that conversation, they're welcome to have it. But today there's no plan and no expectation, and we're not working toward that end at this time. We have a great partnership, and it will continue as long as it needs to.
I wonder if you're going to feel the same way about this next question, which appears to me to have some real advantages to it. Will Space Force be taking on more missions and facilities from the Air Force, such as the electro-optical telescopes on Maui? And if you need a former Army guy to help with that particular mission, I just want to say for the record that I'm available right now.
So we already have, and you're right. I've asked several times whether they needed a 4-star commander of the Maui side as well. But no, we already have, as part of, so there were 11 major commands inside of the United States Air Force prior to the creation of U.S. Space Force. And one of those was Air Force Space Command. So that was the Air Force command that built and operated all of those space capabilities. The U.S. Space Force, when it was created in December of 2019, was in essence Air Force Space Command renamed. In our first year, in fact, within 150 days of being established as a service, there were space elements inside of our research laboratory. There were other acquisition organizations in other places. There were intelligence units. There were other places inside the Air Force where we had space capabilities and space units. Within 150 days of establishing the U.S. Space Force, we brought in, either in whole or in part, elements of 23 other Air Force units that were space related. And it includes, by the way, the optical site at Maui. That is now part of the U.S. Space Force. And that's right. So we've definitely secured the high ground in that sense. But we moved rapidly, like I said, about all are part of 23 other organizations. We created our own and submitted our own budget for the first time. We've done a whole lot of those things. Our best partner in all of this, we've had a lot of great support and a lot of great partnership. Our best partner in all of this to date has been the United States Air Force and the Department of the Air Force.
I'm reminded, sir, a little bit as you talk about standing up the Space Force of the separation of the U.S. Army Air Corps from the U.S. Army now 70 plus years ago. And some of my Air Force friends have suggested that the Army didn't always give the Air Force, the nascent Air Force, the best possible bases located in the most geographically desirable locations. But I'm glad to see that the Air Force didn't hold on to Maui, it gave it to you.
Well, so as you noted, you weren't around in the 1930s. I wasn't around in 1947. I have been told that, I don't know if it's apocryphal but I have been told that was more akin to a divorce than it was an amicable separation. I don't know for sure, but I will tell you that the leadership of the Air Force, starting with the last Chief Staff of the Air Force, General Dave Goldfein, and carry on with his successor, General C.Q. Brown, and top to bottom, I've always been proud. I spent 35 years as an airman in the United States Air Force. I've always been proud of that service and proud of that service. As good as I expected the support to be, it has been even better than I personally could have hoped. They have been tremendous partners. They are as committed to the success of the U.S. Space Force as we are, and it makes me proud to be a former airman, to watch what they're doing for us.
Yes, sir. And as we discussed before the call, I actually spent a semester at the U.S. Air Force Academy on exchange from West Point, and you'll be pleased to hear that every single day as we were marching to lunch, I sang at the top of my lungs, "Nothing can stop the Army Air Corps." You can imagine how well that went down. I think you just answered this question, but it sounds like the U.S. Space Force has a separate budget line from the U.S. Air Force. That separation, it sounds like, was both amicable and complete.
It is amicable. It is not entirely complete, and that's a little bit of the nature of the difference between us and the separation of the U.S. Air Force in 1947, and also slightly different than the U.S. Navy and the United States Marine Corps. Again, those are two services organized in one department, the Department of the Navy. We are very lean. We are very focused on the mission, and we continue and will continue to rely for a long time on the support of the U.S. Air Force. The Space Force, one of the reasons we're so small is we are space operators, we are acquisition officers, we're engineers, we're intelligence professionals, and we're cyberspace operators. We talked about cybersecurity and cyber attack earlier. We have Space Force bases. We need our Space Force bases to operate. We need civil engineers. We need personnelists. We need security forces. We need medics. We need JAGs. We need a whole logisticians. We need a whole set of other functions to allow us to operate. The United States Air Force, both in uniform member and civilians, will continue to conduct those operations and those functions for us. And so while we have a separate budget, and that budget is focused separately primarily on acquisition and development and fielding and operations of space capabilities, there is some overlap in the budget when it comes to the funds needed to operate bases, to do logistics and those things. So it is nicely separated today, but it's not exclusively and completely separated.
And you work for the Secretary of the Air Force.
Correct. Both.
Civilian.
Absolutely correct. Both work for the Secretary of the Air Force. In the same way, like I said, the Secretary of the Navy is responsible for both the U.S. Navy and the U.S. Marine Corps.
Thanks, sir. I'd like to go back to some of the sort of hard conflict stuff. Can I get you to talk a little bit about the role of Space Force in deterring future conflict, both on the high end of the spectrum of conflict and conceivably on the low end?
Yeah. So I would say for a host of reasons, it is very, very likely that a conflict, especially a high-end conflict with another great power, could begin in space or could extend very quickly to space for a whole host of reasons. The first is the reliance we have on space, as we talked about, with GPS to navigate, the ability to communicate, the ISR that we collect. In the future, increasingly, the connectivity that the joint force will use to quickly find, fix, and attack targets, the ability to look deep into adversaries' homeland without the need to overfly in an airborne sense. So first of all, there's tremendous advantage to operating in space. Second of all, as I noted, our old architecture is very sophisticated and very capable, but also a little bit fragile in the sense that it wasn't designed to operate in conflict. And so the ability, if you can attack it, it's the ability to attack it, the ability to gain advantage, and to affect our ability to operate as a joint force is very high. And so what we need to do as a space force, and what we are doing, is what I discussed earlier, rapidly creating the capability to defend and protect those assets, and to develop more resilient and robust architectures that that adversaries will look to and be concerned that they will not be able to attack effectively. And so that aspect of deterrence will be a resilient, robust architecture. They know that they can't gain and seize an advantage by attacking us in space. And so that should come with a deterrent value. The second piece is increasingly missions are moving to space. You're probably very familiar with ground moving target indication and some of those other things. Some of those things we count on today, and we count on to be able to do in an airborne sense. In the very high threat environments that we deal in today, especially in the early stages of conflict, if in fact we need to look deep, deep into enemy homelands, those missions increasingly will be conducted from space. Our ability to do that, our ability to see and track and assess and understand continuously should also provide a deterrent value in terms of an adversary's lack of ability to execute some operation or attack with surprise, because we have the ability to observe so quickly. So I would say, yes, today there's a little bit of fragility there and a little bit of imbalance, but as we increasingly field these new capabilities, defend, protect, and create resilient systems, increasingly there will be a deterrent effect to what we do in space.
I always liked putting scouts on the high ground when I was in the Army. This is sort of the ultimate high ground.
Exactly.
Sir, can I get you to think a little bit about the role of artificial intelligence in space, and think through the human in the loop, which is one issue when you're dealing with terrestrial communications distances, but when you've got something 100 miles up in the sky, it's an entirely different question, I think.
Right. On it, it seems like it, in some ways it is, in some ways the challenges are similar to what we're faced with in other domains. First of all, let's call it from a robotic sense and a remotely operated sense, many, the other domains are headed in our direction with, right, unmanned vehicles, with remotely operated vehicles, and those, and with AI. In a sense, from the beginning, we've been remotely operated and robotic in terms of our satellites. And so some of that we already understand and know how to do from an autonomous sense. And of course, we continue to learn more about that day in, day out, year in, year out. From an AI perspective, though, you're exactly right. Because of the great distances involved, because of the need to see and understand and forecast, and because of depending on the types of attacks and weapons, they may occur very quickly. We may not have the time we want for the human to see, understand, decide, and respond. We're going to need to count on AI in a lot of those areas. At the same time, just like the other services and military forces, we have the responsibility for ethical conduct, for adherence to the law of armed conflict, and all those things that you learned and I've learned in terms of a professional force, a responsible force, a force that reflects the values of the American public and our nation and the way we conduct war. We're still going to have all of those responsibilities when it comes to potential conflict in space. And so in some senses, AI and autonomous operations, especially when it comes to seeing threats, understanding threats, reacting to and defeating threats that intend to harm us, probably some level of autonomy certainly with humans in advance designing and understanding and build in the conditions and responses. But ultimately, in some cases, humans are going to be on the loop making decisions, and for the management of violence, especially when you talk about violence on behalf of the nation that affects other nations and other people, at some level, certainly going to need to continue to have humans in the loop going into the future.
Yes, sir. I've got a piece of information that you may already have, but Stephanie tells me that there's a Japanese space debris removal company with their U.S. headquarters in Denver named Astroscale. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
So I'm going to have to go Google that one when I'm done. But
Astroscale, it's a great name.
That's right. If they really, really are effective, if they can, I'll see about writing a check if they can remove debris by the ton. I'll write a check for every ton of debris they can remove. And in fact, I will say that's one of the things that we look forward to and hope to see in the future is with the potential investment in and proliferation of commercial services, increasingly things like that we can buy as services rather than in the past we've been required to build and operate and provide on our own. There's a whole host of those. And as an example, I'll use let's use transport, right? In years past, the Army, used trucks to transport a whole host of its supplies and equipment. In some cases, you still use those today because they go places that others won't. But in other cases, you use UPS and you use all those other delivery services, and so the more and more we can depend on commercial space for what I'll call routine activities like space transportation, perhaps space debris removal and other things, we can focus on the things we do best and we're required to do, which is national security and military operations in support of the nation.
Yes, sir. So we're getting close to out of time, and I realize one of the questions prompts me to recognize that I have not done a good job of allowing you to brag on your people. So can I offer you that opportunity? The specific question was two questions. One is what percent of the force is female? But another question is, do you have a hard time attracting and retaining talent, given that people who can do these sorts of jobs can presumably get paid even bigger dollars in some of the private sector opportunities we've been talking about? So can I get you to talk about your force a little bit?
Yeah. So overall, our force is about the average, slightly, in fact, it's unfortunately slightly below average for the rest of the armed forces and the Air Force in terms of female. We're up there, like I said, in the right around, depending on the rank, depending on the specific specialty. Typically, it ranges from the high teens up to around 30%. Depending on, like I said, which rank, which specialty. So it's in line with everybody else. But frankly, we're hoping and looking for opportunity to grow it like we are some of the various race and ethnicity numbers. We absolutely believe that you need to look like and reflect the nation that you serve. And so we continue to focus on some of those diversity and inclusion initiatives that will do that for us, at the same time meeting the requirements we have for expertise inside the force. In terms of ability to recruit and retain, actually right now, we're in a pretty good place for a couple of reasons. One is those space companies are there. There's about as much supply as there is demand for those capabilities today. And those who are interested in military service come here first. The second is there's a tremendous enthusiasm and energy as a result of the creation of the Space Force. And so we actually do have a lot of folks who may not be interested in joining the Army or the Navy or the Marine Corps, who have specifically said they'd like to join the Space Force. And our requirements right now are in the hundreds of officers and enlisted members per year, so we can be relatively selective in that regard. Our challenge is, and our primary challenge is, especially among our enlisted force, they get to, as you said, about the 10 to 12 year point, and they're in high demand. And frankly, they love the nation, they love to serve, but it's also when you're when you're offered 2 and 3 and 4 times your current salary. There are some that go and look other places. So part of our human capital strategy and what we're hoping to do and what we're building right now is what I'll call human capital strategy for the 21st century, is to find ways to incentivize and reward individuals for that deep expertise that they can build and retain and use inside the force over a long term. What I'll call some of the personnel models that serve the other services, right? As an example, the other services have a model that supports bringing in large numbers of folks and attriting them out over the years. Ours is probably more focused on bringing them in, growing them, training them deeply, and keeping them. And so some of the models that worked for the Air Force, that work for the Army, that work for the Marine Corps and the Navy, probably won't work for us well in the future. And so we're building a human capital strategy focused on that and the opportunity for folks to serve in a variety of ways over the long term.
So this has been a privilege and hugely enlightening for me, and I'm sure for our audience. Raleigh is about to come back on and close us out, but before she goes, everybody is thinking this. I get to ask it: Star Wars or Star Trek?
So I have to pick. It's kind of like picking among your children. Well, so first of all, let me say clearly, I love both. Star Wars for its entertainment value, for the idea to imagine and entertain and in that regard, and in some sense inspire. But if you really force me to pick and put them in priority order, I would probably put Star Trek #1. And the reason I would is when you think about, especially going back to the 1960s, when I was a boy, the dark ages, it cast a vision for who we could be and what we could do. It dealt with the issues of the day. It challenged you to think new and different ways, and inspired you, and it said that, this is perhaps something we as a human race could achieve in the future. And for all those reasons, I would say, while I enjoy them both, and I will never not be found in a theater for any new Star Trek or Star Wars movie, if I had to pick, if I had to prioritize, I would go Star Trek 1, Star Wars 2.
So that's the first thing I've disagreed with you on, but I'm enormously grateful for your service to our nation and that of all of the guardians you represent, and for your time this afternoon. You've left the Foreign Policy Research Institute better educated, better informed, and hence I hope better citizens, better able to support your guardians and all the good work you all do every day.
Thanks so much. And if I can, both to you and to Dr. Flynn and all the others, first of all, for both of you, for your service. Those of us who are still in uniform get the privilege of the gratitude and the thanks of Americans every single day. It's greatly appreciated. We get tremendous support. But for those of you for whom we stand on the shoulders, if I used my English correctly, and for those who have served for years, served the nation for years, but never in uniform, thanks to you all for what you have done and continue to do for the security of the nation and support of the U.S. Space Force. Have a great day.
You too, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, John. And especially thank you, General Thompson. That was just a fascinating discussion, as evidenced by the more than 40 questions in our Q&A box. That is not typical. And as the daughter of an Army Air Corps veteran, I was particularly interested. So thank you for that. Before I leave you all, I would also like to give a shout out for a few upcoming events. On March 18th from 2 to 3 p.m., we'll have a discussion with Jacques Delisle and Alex Wong on collaborating on climate. Can the US and China collaborate? March 23rd from 2 to 3 p.m., The Spy Master's Prism. It's a new book by the former chief of CIA clandestine operations, Jack Devine, and he'll be talking with Ron Granieri about that new book. March 25th, 11 a.m. to 12 p.m., we'll have a special FPRI briefing with Chris Miller, Maya Otarashvili, and Daniel Tannenbaum discussing the implications of the new Biden administration sanctions on Russia. Finally, on March 30th, 11 a.m. to 12 p.m., our Africa program will be hosting an update on the situation in Ethiopia and Tigray. It's a crisis that threatens to spill over into the whole Horn of Africa, and our chair of the Africa program, Ambassador Charles Ray, will be hosting a discussion featuring several former U.S. ambassadors to Ethiopia. So without further ado, thank you all again for joining us this afternoon. And John Nagl, please thank you to you and the Haverford School for hosting us. General Thompson, we hope to have you back again. Thank you.